Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that could ruin your reputation before you even opened your mouth: your clothing in Victorian England. This was a world where a single wrong button, a slightly frayed collar, or the sheer audacity to wear last season's sleeves could get you quietly judged, whispered about, and mentally filed under not our sort of person. Forget freedom of expression. In the 1800s, your outfit was a full background check stitched in wool, and everyone around you was reading it like the morning paper. A huge thank you to the lovely viewer who suggested tonight's topic. These ideas are the beating heart of what we do here, and they genuinely shape every journey we take together. So if you enjoy tonight's slow descent into itchy collars and social doom, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always half past exhausted somewhere. We are also over on Spotify now, so if you would rather drift off with just my voice and no screen glowing in your face, the link is waiting for you in the description. And for those who want a little more, there is a standalone 8-hour ad-free video tucked away for channel members, perfect for the nights when one story simply is not long enough. No pressure at all. It is just there if you ever fancy it. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and loosen any waistband currently plotting against you. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what your clothes would have said about you back then? Would your comfy weekend outfit have marked you as respectable, or as someone the neighbours quietly pray for? Could you have survived an entire day trapped inside a corset that rearranged your internal organs? Did people really own only one good outfit and simply hope for the best? And what exactly happened if you turned up to a funeral in the wrong shade of black? Tonight we find out. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1859 in a country where your wardrobe is your resume, your bank statement, and your character reference all sewn into one deeply uncomfortable ensemble. Good luck. Before you've said a single word, before you've shaken a hand or offered a polite comment about the weather, you've already been judged, sorted, and shelved. In Victorian England, your clothing does the talking, and it never quite shuts up. Every stitch, every fabric, every slightly wrong shade broadcasts your income, your job, your morals, and whether you are worth speaking to at all. You're not simply wearing an outfit, you're wearing a signboard, and the entire street is reading it, and they are thorough readers. A stranger passing you on the pavement takes in the cut of your coat, the state of your boots, the whiteness of your collar, and the quality of your gloves, and by the time they have drawn level with you, they have already decided roughly what you earn and whether they ought to nod. It is a little like being scanned at a checkout, except the barcode is your entire body and the machine is a disapproving duchess with excellent eyesight. There is a strange logic to it all. In a world without credit scores, without job titles printed neatly on a card, without any of the paperwork we now use to size each other up, clothing had to do the heavy lifting. It was the fastest, most honest shorthand anyone had. A gentleman could not exactly wave his bank statement at you across a drawing room, but he could wear a coat so precisely tailored that no words were needed. His clothes announced him before he opened his mouth, and thank goodness, because half the time what came out of his mouth was deeply boring. For the people around you, reading clothing was not snobbery so much as survival. You needed to know, quickly, how to treat the person in front of you, bow or nod, step aside or expect them to, address them as sir or barely address them at all. Get it wrong in either direction and you had committed a small social disaster, the sort that got repeated at dinner parties for a week. So everyone learned to read the fabric fluently, the way you might learn to read the mood of a boss before deciding whether today is a good day to ask for a raise. The cruel part is how little room there was to argue with the verdict. You could not simply decide to dress above your station and get away with it. Every layer had rules, and the people who mattered knew all of them. Wear the wrong glove, the wrong hat, the wrong shade of the right colour, and you did not look aspirational. You looked like a fraud, which in this society was somehow worse than looking poor. Poverty was at least respectable. Pretending was not. And so from the moment you woke, your clothing became a kind of performance you could never step out of. There was no changing into something comfortable to nip to the shops, because nipping to the shops was itself a public appearance, and public appearances were exactly when the judging happened. Comfort was a luxury you wore only in private, if at all. In front of others, you wore your reputation, and it pinched. Think of your softest weekend outfit, the one held together by good intentions and an old drawstring. In Victorian England, that outfit would have marked you instantly as someone the neighbours quietly pray for, which is a heavy thing to know first thing in the morning. So let's begin where every Victorian day began, with the long and complicated business of putting all this reputation on. Morning arrives, and with it the daily ordeal known as getting dressed. If you are a respectable woman, this is not a quick affair. You do not simply throw something on and stumble toward breakfast. Oh no, you're about to assemble yourself, layer by careful layer, like a very fashionable onion, and you will almost certainly need help to do it. Somewhere in this rising pile of fabric is a human being. Your entire job this morning is to bury her completely. You begin with the layer against your skin, then add another, and another, each one with its own name, its own purpose, and its own strong opinion about how much you are allowed to bend. By the time you're finished, you will be wearing a small textile warehouse, and you will have done it in a cold bedroom while someone laces buttons and hooks you into place behind your back. This is not an outfit you can put on alone. It is an outfit that requires a team, a plan, and roughly the same amount of time modern people spend deciding what to watch before giving up and going to sleep. The cold is part of the experience. Bedrooms in the morning were genuinely freezing, the fire long dead, the air sharp enough to make your fingers clumsy. So the layers were not only about fashion or modesty, they were also very practically about not turning blue. Each fresh layer was a small negotiation between looking correct and simply staying warm, and warmth usually lost, because looking correct was the entire point of getting up. If you had a maid, this was her morning too, and it was a delicate dance. She threaded the laces, fastened the tiny buttons that ran up your back like a spine of their own, and settled each layer smooth so no lump or wrinkle betrayed the effort underneath. The finished look was meant to appear effortless, as though you had simply floated into being, fully assembled and serene. Nobody was supposed to think about the 20 minutes of grunting and tugging that got you there. It was the original filter, applied by hand, and if you had no maid, you improvised. Corsets that laced up the front instead of the back, garments arranged the night before, a sister or a neighbour pressed into service. Getting dressed became a favour you traded, a bit like asking someone to hold the other end of a fitted sheet, except the fitted sheet was your torso, and the stakes were your entire day's respectability. Every layer also had to survive the layers to come. Put something on in the wrong order and the whole structure failed, like assembling flat-pack furniture and realising 3 steps too late that a crucial panel is now trapped inside. There was no going back without starting over, and starting over meant unlacing everything and standing in the cold again while your good mood quietly left the room. Then there was the sheer weight of it. Fully dressed, you might be carrying many pounds of fabric before you had even reached the stairs. You did not so much wear these clothes as haul them about all day, on your own frame, powered by breakfast you had not yet been allowed to eat. Simply existing was a workout, and you did it with a straight face and a pleasant expression. By the time you were finally fully dressed, you had achieved something close to armour. and at the very heart of that armour, laced tighter than anything else you owned, sat the piece that shaped everything above it. So let's talk about the corset. Let's start with the foundation of it all, quite literally, the corset. Before anything else goes on, your torso is laced into a rigid cage of whalebone, cord, and grim determination. The goal is a tiny waist, an upright posture, and the faint air of a woman who has never once slouched or enjoyed a large dinner. The reward for achieving this silhouette is admiration and status. The cost is the ability to breathe deeply, bend at the middle, or drop something and ever realistically hope to pick it up again. The corset works by taking your soft, sensible middle and persuading it firmly to become a different shape. Strips of whalebone or steel run through the fabric to hold everything rigid, and a long lace pulls the whole thing tight against your body. The tighter it is laced, the smaller your waist appears, and the more upright you're forced to sit, because sagging is no longer physically available to you as an option. It is posture by architecture. You're not standing up straight, you're being held up straight by engineering. The sensation is difficult to overstate. There is a constant firm pressure around your ribs and stomach, a squeeze that never lets go from morning until night. Deep breaths become shallow ones. Bending forward becomes a careful tilt from the hips. Sneezing becomes an event you brace for. It is a bit like being permanently, gently hugged by someone who does not know their own strength and refuses to let go until bedtime. And yet, for all the discomfort, the corset was not simply torture for its own sake. It was normal. Most women wore some form of it every single day from a young age, and a properly fitted one was less a medieval device, and more a very firm, supportive garment, the sort of thing you got used to and even relied on. It shaped the clothes, it supported the back, and it held everything in the outline that Victorian eyes read as respectable and refined. To go without one in public was very nearly to appear undressed, the equivalent of turning up to the office in pyjamas and hoping nobody mentions it. The trouble came with the extremes. Fashion always wants more, and a small waist was so prized that some laced far tighter than comfort or common sense allowed, chasing an ever more dramatic silhouette. Pulled to its limits, the corset could genuinely restrict, leaving the wearer breathless, faint, and desperate to sit down somewhere private and quietly reassemble her internal geography. This is where the fainting couch earned its keep, and where a great many dramatic swoons had a very practical explanation. It also quietly told the world what kind of life you led. A woman laced into a fashionable, unyielding shape was announcing that she did not have to lift, carry, scrub, or bend for a living, because in that outfit she simply could not. The corset was a wearable statement that said, very clearly, that manual labour was somebody else's problem. Her discomfort was a luxury. Only the well-off could afford to be that impractical for that many hours a day. So the corset was two things at once. It was a support and a signal, a comfort and a constraint, a garment that held you together while very slowly wearing you out. You wore it because everyone wore it, and because the shape it gave you was the shape the world had agreed to admire. Of course, a tiny waist only looks tiny by comparison, which is why the next job was to make everything below it as wide as humanly possible. Which brings us, alarmingly, to the crinoline. Now that your middle is safely caged, it is time to expand everything below it. Enter the crinoline, a vast dome of hooped steel that turns your lower half into something resembling a small, elegant tent. The wider your skirt, the wealthier you appear, because a woman drowning in that much fabric clearly does not need to squeeze through narrow doorways or do anything useful with her legs. You will knock over furniture, you will get wedged in door frames, and you will look absolutely magnificent doing it. The clever thing about the crinoline was that it solved a real problem, Achieving that fashionably huge skirt used to mean wearing petticoat after petticoat until you could barely move, hot, heavy, and exhausting. Then someone had the bright idea of building a lightweight cage of flexible steel hoops that held the skirt out on its own. Suddenly, you could have the enormous silhouette without hauling around a mattress of underskirts. It felt at first like liberation. It was, in every other respect, a hazard, because the crinoline came with consequences the size of the crinoline itself. You could no longer judge how much space you took up, because you now took up a great deal more of it than your body suggested. You swept past a side table and cleared it entirely. You turned to greet someone and knocked a teacup into the next county. Sitting down became a strategic operation involving a careful gathering of hoops, lest the whole contraption tip up at the front and reveal everything to the room. Every chair was a gamble. Every doorway was a negotiation. Then there was the wind, that great enemy of dignity. A stiff gust could catch the vast surface of your skirt like a sail and turn a gentle stroll into an unexpected voyage. Women were genuinely tugged about by the breeze, skirts billowing, hoops swinging, all while trying to maintain a serene expression that said this was entirely intentional. It was the fashion equivalent of holding an umbrella in a storm and pretending you have it fully under control. Despite all this, the wide skirt did its social job beautifully. It made the waist above it look impossibly small by contrast. It filled a room with impressive presence, and it screamed from a considerable distance that you could afford yards and yards of good fabric. That was the real message stitched into all that steel. Cloth cost money, and a skirt this size used an almost absurd amount of it. To wear one was to walk around draped in your own wealth, gently bumping into things. It also, once again, quietly ruled out useful work. You cannot cook over a low fire, tend animals, or move briskly through a crowded workshop while wearing a structure the width of a garden gate. The crinoline was a garment for a life of drawing rooms and calling cards, not scrubbing and hauling. Its very impracticality was the boast. It said, without a word, that your days were spent doing precisely nothing strenuous, which in this world was the height of aspiration. For working women, of course, this was a fantasy, though many wore smaller, humbler versions to feel a little of the fashion, but the grandest hoops belonged to those with the space, the servants, and the sheer freedom to be that inconvenient on purpose. Being difficult to fit through a door was, believe it or not, the dream. Yet for all its size, the crinoline was only the visible half of the story. Beneath it, layer upon quiet layer, another whole wardrobe was hard at work. So let's lift the hem carefully and talk about petticoats. Beneath that grand skirt lives a secret world of petticoats, and the number you wear tells its own quiet story. Before the hooped crinoline arrived to do the heavy lifting, achieving a fashionable shape meant stacking petticoat upon petticoat upon petticoat, until walking felt like wading through a hedge. Nobody can actually see them, but that is rather the whole point. In this world, even your underwear is busy signalling that you can afford considerably more fabric than sense. A petticoat is, at its simplest, an underskirt, and in the early Victorian years you did not wear one. You wore several, each layered over the last, each adding a little more fullness to the shape above. Some were plain, some were starched stiff to hold their form, and some were quilted or corded to push the skirt out even further. Together they built the silhouette from the inside, the way scaffolding shapes a building nobody is meant to see behind the finished front. The feeling of all this was warm, heavy, and faintly ridiculous. Your legs moved inside a swishing forest of fabric, each step brushing cloth against cloth with a soft, constant rustle that followed you everywhere. In winter it was a blessing, wrapping you in layers against the cold. In summer it was a slow, private ordeal, trapping the heat until you longed to peel the whole lot off and lie down somewhere cool and lawless. Even after the steel crinoline took over the job of holding the skirt wide, the petticoat did not simply retire. It stayed on, worn over the cage to soften its hard edges, so the outline of the hoops did not print through the fine outer skirt like the bars of a very fashionable prison. A good layer of petticoat smoothed everything into that dreamy floating shape the era adored. Without it, the whole illusion collapsed, and you were quite obviously a woman standing inside a bit of bent metal. The number and quality of your petticoats were naturally another quiet class signal. More petticoats meant more fabric, and more fabric meant more money, and finer petticoats, trimmed with tucks or delicate work at the hem, meant money you were comfortable spending on things nobody would ever admire out loud. It was luxury for its own sake, hidden luxury, the kind you knew was there even when the world did not, a bit like wearing your very best socks to an event where you will never once remove your shoes. Keeping them clean was its own endless battle. Petticoats swept the ground, gathering the mud, dust and general filth of a Victorian street along their lower edges. The hems grew grubby with astonishing speed, which meant constant washing for the poorer woman doing her own laundry, or a steady stream of soiled underskirts for the servants of the rich to boil back to white. A pristine hem, glimpsed for half a second as you climbed a step, quietly announced that the dirt of the world was somebody else's job. So the humble petticoat carried a surprising weight of meaning for something no one was supposed to see. It shaped you, warmed you, softened your outline, and testified silently to your comfort, all from beneath. It was the unsung workhorse of the wardrobe, doing its duty in the dark while the outer skirt took all the credit. But even the petticoats were not the true bottom of this layered world. Beneath them sat the plainest, most private garment of all, the one that touched your actual skin. So let's go all the way down to the chemise and the drawers. Right at the very bottom of all this engineering sits the humble chemise, a simple linen or cotton garment worn against the bare skin. Its job is unglamorous but vital, to soak up sweat and body oil so your expensive outer layers never have to touch anything as vulgar as an actual human being. Because washing a delicate silk gown is a nightmare, but boiling a plain chemise is easy. Your underwear, in short, is the only thing in your entire wardrobe that ever gets properly clean. The chemise is a plain, loose shift, usually white, cut simply, and made to be washed hard and often. It sits directly on the skin, beneath the corset, beneath everything, forming a soft barrier between your body and the rigid, precious layers above. Think of it as the buffer that saves the good clothes, the way you might wrap something fragile before posting it, except the fragile thing is a very costly dress, and the packing material is the only thing standing between it and a lifetime of stains. This mattered enormously, because keeping clothes clean in Victorian England was genuinely difficult. Fine outer garments could not simply be thrown in with the wash. Silks, fine wools, and elaborately trimmed gowns were fragile, dye-prone, and impossible to launder without ruin, so they were sponged, aired, and brushed rather than washed, and worn many times between cleanings. The chemise took the daily punishment of the body, so those garments did not have to. It was the sacrificial layer, and it earned its keep every single day. Alongside the chemise came the drawers, a pair of loose leg coverings that were, for a good stretch of the era, split down the middle and left open. This was not a scandal, but a practicality, since climbing in and out of the entire towering outfit every time nature called was simply not realistic. The open design was quiet common sense, born of a wardrobe that took 20 minutes and an assistant to remove. Fashion, it turned out, had to make room for the occasional trip to the necessary house. The feel of these underthings was, mercifully, the most comfortable part of the whole ensemble. Soft, breathable, and light against the skin, the chemise was the one honest layer that asked nothing of you and simply did its job. After the grip of the corset and the weight of the petticoats, the plain linen next to your body was almost a kindness, the equivalent of the soft old shirt you change into the moment the guests have finally gone home. Cleanliness of underwear was also quietly a marker of respectability. Fresh white linen against the skin was a sign of care, of standards, of a household that kept up with its washing. Grey, stale, or ragged underthings told a harder story of poverty and struggle, of a home where soap and time were both in short supply. Nobody outside would see it, and yet everyone somehow understood that a person who kept clean linen next to their skin was a person keeping themselves together. So the chemise and drawers were the foundation beneath the foundation, the true first layer, humble and unseen and absolutely essential. They protected the expensive clothes, spared the body some comfort, and testified in private to the standards of the whole household. Now that you're dressed from the skin outward, it is worth stepping back and asking what all these layers were actually made of, because in this world, the very cloth was talking. So let's talk about fabric. Time to talk about what everything is actually made of, because in Victorian England, the fabric is doing at least half the gossiping. Silk whispers money, fine wool murmurs respectability, sturdy cotton and rough fustian announce rather loudly that you work for your living. A trained eye can read the difference clean across a crowded room, and nearly everyone here has a trained eye. Wear the wrong cloth to the wrong occasion, and you may as well have pinned your weekly wages to your chest. Start at the top with silk. Silk was the fabric of wealth, imported, expensive, and difficult to care for, with a soft sheen that caught the light in a way no cheaper cloth could imitate. It rustled when you moved, a sound sometimes described as the whisper of money itself, and that sound was half the appeal. To wear silk was to be heard as well as seen, gliding into a room accompanied by the faint, unmistakable hush of expense. Cheaper fabrics could copy the colour but never quite the sound. Below silk sat fine wool, the sensible backbone of the respectable wardrobe. Good wool was warm, held its shape, took dye beautifully and lasted, which made it the fabric of the solid middle sort, the professionals and the comfortable. It did not shout wealth the way silk did, but it spoke clearly of stability, of a person who was doing perfectly well and wanted you to know it without appearing to try. Wool was the fabric equivalent of a firm handshake and a paid mortgage. Then came cotton, and here the story splits. Fine, printed cotton could be pretty and perfectly respectable for day wear, especially as the mills made it cheaper and more available than ever before. But coarse, heavy cotton and rough fustian, the tough, hard-wearing cloth of the labouring man, told a very different tale. This was fabric built to survive work, to take dirt and friction and endless washing, and it draped on the body like exactly what it was. Honest cloth for people who use their hands. The truly telling thing was not just the fibre, but the quality within it. Two coats might both be wool, yet one was fine, closely woven, and beautifully finished, while the other was thin, loose, and already going shiny at the elbows. The difference was money, and everyone could see it. It is much like today, when two people wear the same basic garment, and yet one somehow reads as expensive and the other does not. The Victorians simply had this instinct sharpened to a fine and merciless point. Occasion mattered as much as means. Even a wealthy person did not wear their finest silk to tramp about in the morning, and even a poor person tried to keep one better piece for church. There was a fabric for every setting, and turning up in the wrong one, too fine for the moment or too coarse for the company, marked you out just as surely as wearing the wrong colour or the wrong hat. Fabric was a language with grammar, and misusing it was a visible mistake. For the poor, all of this played out at the humbler end of the scale, in the difference between a decent bit of cloth and a threadbare one, between something bought new and something worn soft by 3 previous owners. But the reading never stopped. Rich or poor, everyone was fluent, and everyone was being read. Yet fabric was only one half of what your clothes were saying. The other half lived in the colour, and colour, as it happened, was about to become very complicated indeed. So let's talk about dye. Now consider colour, because a Victorian wardrobe is not just about cut and cloth. It is about which dyes you can afford to drape yourself in. For centuries, rich, vivid colour was staggeringly expensive, the guarded preserve of the wealthy. Then chemistry arrived, and suddenly a shocking new purple called mauve exploded across the fashionable world. Bright colour became a boast. A deep, even, unfaded hue told everyone that someone had paid dearly for it. A patchy, sun-bleached one told them the opposite. For most of human history, colour came from the earth and its living things, from plants, insects and minerals, coaxed into dye through slow and costly labour. The brightest, most stable colours were the hardest to make and the most jealously priced, which is why deep, rich shades had long been the mark of the powerful. A brilliant, even colour that did not fade was a small miracle of expense, and wearing it announced that you could command that miracle at will. Then, in the middle of the century, a young chemist stumbled onto a brilliant purple dye while messing about with coal tar of all things, and the world of colour changed almost overnight. This new shade, mauve, could be made in a factory rather than wrung from nature drop by precious drop. A wave of these new synthetic dyes followed, in purples, magentas and greens brighter and bolder than anything seen before. Fashion predictably lost its mind. Everyone who could wanted to wear the astonishing new colours, and for a while to be seen in them was to be seen as thoroughly modern. But even as the dyes grew cheaper to make, colour kept its power to signal. A garment dyed a deep, rich, perfectly even shade still spoke of quality, because good dyeing was skilled work and cheap dyeing showed. Poorly dyed cloth came out blotchy, streaked, or dull, and worse, it faded fast. Sun, sweat and washing all leached the colour away, so that a once bright dress slowly turned tired and grey at the edges. The state of your colour told the world how new your clothes were and how well they had been made. This gave the poor away without mercy. Their clothes were often bought second-hand, already faded from a previous life, then washed and worn until the colour surrendered entirely. A sun-bleached shoulder, a collar gone pale, a black dress turned rusty brown, all quietly confessed that these were old clothes, much used, long past their first owner. You could read a person's whole finances in how faithfully their colour had held. Black deserves its own mention, because black was everywhere and meant a great deal. A truly deep, rich black was surprisingly difficult and costly to achieve and keep, so good black cloth read as serious money and serious respectability. It was the colour of formal wear, of solemn occasions and of mourning, worn in vast quantities across the era. A fine, unfaded black was quietly impressive. A cheap black that had drifted toward green or brown told everyone it had been dyed on a budget and worn far too long. So colour in Victorian England was never simply decoration. It was a running commentary on your money, your taste, and the freshness of your wardrobe, written in shades that everyone around you knew how to interpret. To dress in bold, well-dyed colour was to make a claim, and the world checked your claim against the evidence. But some of those dazzling new colours hid a darker truth, one that cost far more than money. Before we admire that fashionable green a moment longer, we need to talk honestly about what it was made of. But some colours came at a far higher price than money. Take the gorgeous, vivid green that was all the rage, the kind that made ball gowns glow and artificial flowers look freshly picked. That colour was often made using arsenic. The women who wore it risked their skin, and the workers who made it, many of them very young, handled poison day after day in the name of a fashionable shade. Behind the beauty of that green lay real and quiet suffering, and it deserves to be remembered plainly. The green itself was genuinely striking, a bright, clear, almost luminous shade that stood out from the softer natural colours around it. It appeared in gowns and gloves, in headdresses and hair ornaments, in artificial leaves and flowers, and even in wallpapers, paints, and children's toys. It was fashionable, desirable, and everywhere. And the compound that produced it contained arsenic, a substance we now understand to be deeply dangerous, but which was then used freely, without the knowledge or protection that would have saved so many. For those who wore the colour, the risks were real, if uneven. Contact with the skin, exposure to the dust that shed from the fabric, and the slow breakdown of the material over time could all cause harm, ranging from irritation and rashes to more serious illness. People did not always connect their symptoms to their clothing, because the danger was invisible and the fashion was so widely accepted. It is a sobering thought that something worn for beauty could quietly damage the body of the person wearing it. But the heaviest cost fell not on those who wore the green, but on those who made it. The work of colouring artificial flowers and leaves, of handling the powder that gave the green its glow, was done largely by women and girls, many of them very young, labouring long hours for little pay. They breathed the dust and touched the compound day after day, often without any real protection, because the true nature of the danger was neither understood nor acknowledged in time. Their health suffered for it, and some suffered gravely. The details of individual cases when they came to light were genuinely distressing, and there is no need to dwell on them beyond acknowledging what happened. Workers fell ill. Some were permanently harmed. The connection between the beautiful colour and the human damage behind it was slow to be accepted and slower still to be acted upon. For a long time, the fashion simply continued, and the people paying the true price were largely unseen by those admiring the results in a ballroom. It is worth pausing on this, because it says something important about the whole glittering world of Victorian dress. The finery that signalled status and taste did not appear by magic. It was made by human hands, often the hands of the poor, the young, and the powerless, working in conditions that we would find unacceptable now, and that caused genuine harm then. The gap between the elegance on display and the suffering behind it was vast and easy to ignore, and that ease is part of the story. Eventually, growing awareness and mounting evidence turned opinion against the arsenic colours, and safer methods and materials gradually took their place. But the change came too late for many who had already been harmed in the making of a fashionable shade. So when we picture that beautiful green glowing under the lamplight, it is right to remember the cost. And it is a reminder as we move on that even the simplest seeming details of a wardrobe carried weight. Something as plain as the colour white, for instance, quietly said a great deal. Let's return to something simpler and stranger. The colour white, and specifically how impossibly clean you managed to keep it. A bright white collar, a spotless cuff, a crisp shirt front. These were not merely tidy, they were a statement. They announced that you did no dirty work, that you had the means to keep linen laundered and gleaming, and that soot, the constant grey enemy of every Victorian city, somehow dared not touch you. Whiteness, here, was wealth you could read from across the road. To understand why white mattered so much, you have to understand the air. Victorian cities ran on coal, and coal meant smoke, and smoke meant a fine, greasy soot that settled over absolutely everything. It drifted through open windows, clung to buildings, and greyed the washing before it had even dried. In that world, keeping anything truly white was a genuine achievement, a small daily war against the very air you breathed. White did not stay white. White had to be made white, again and again, by someone. That someone was almost never the gentleman wearing the collar. Behind every gleaming shirt front stood hours of labour, of soaking, scrubbing, boiling, bleaching, starching and pressing, usually done by women whose hands paid the price for that crispness. A brilliant white collar was, in effect, the visible tip of an enormous iceberg of unseen work. When you admired it, you were admiring someone else's aching afternoon, whether you realised it or not. This is exactly why white worked as a status signal. It was expensive not so much to buy as to maintain. A poor man might own a shirt, but keeping it truly white day after day through the soot and the labour was beyond his means of time and help. The wealthy could keep their linen immaculate because they could pay others to fight the war on their behalf. So the whiteness itself became proof of comfort, a badge that said the wearer had resources to spare on something as fragile and demanding as staying clean. White also announced, loudly, that you did not do dirty work yourself. You cannot dig, haul, cook over a smoking range, or labour in a workshop and keep your cuffs pristine. Filth is the natural companion of honest physical work, and no amount of care will keep white linen spotless through a day of it. So a spotless collar quietly declared that your hands stayed clean because your days were spent on cleaner things, on paper, on talk, on the comfortable business of not lifting anything heavier than a pen. There was a moral flavour to it too, because the Victorians dearly loved to attach virtue to appearance. Cleanliness was tangled up with respectability, decency and good character, so a clean white collar was read not only as a sign of wealth, but as a sign of a well-ordered life. To be clean was to be good, or at least to look convincingly like it. A grubby collar, by contrast, hinted at more than poverty. It hinted at a person who had somehow let themselves and their standards slip. All of this rested, of course, on the invisible labour of the laundry, a subject grim enough that we will return to it properly before the night is through. For now, simply notice how much meaning was loaded onto something as small as a clean edge of linen. In this world, white was not a colour. It was a claim, and keeping that white edge pristine was such a battle that the Victorians came up with a wonderfully sneaky solution, one that let a man look immaculate at the throat while quietly cutting corners everywhere else. So let's talk about the detachable collar. Here is a clever little trick the Victorian gentleman came to rely on, the detachable collar. Since keeping an entire shirt pristine was both expensive and exhausting, some quiet genius decided that only the parts people actually see need to be spotless. So collars and cuffs were made separate, starched into rigid submission, and swapped out and washed on their own. It meant a man could look immaculate at the throat while the shirt beneath quietly gave up on life. Respectability, it turns out, was mostly about the edges. The logic was beautifully practical. The collar and cuffs are the parts of a shirt that show, framing the face and peeking from the sleeves of a coat, and they are also the parts that get grubby fastest from skin, sweat, and the endless soot in the air. The main body of the shirt, hidden beneath waistcoat and coat, could stay on far longer between washes without anyone being the wiser. So why launder the whole exhausting garment when you could simply replace the bits on display? It was corner cutting elevated to an art form. A gentleman might therefore own a modest number of shirts but a generous supply of collars, swapping a fresh one into place each day while the shirt underneath soldiered on. The collars were starched stiff as a board, so hard they could chafe the neck raw, standing up crisp and gleaming regardless of what quiet compromises were happening below. It is the Victorian equivalent of tidying only the corner of the room that will appear on the video call while chaos reigns just out of frame. The starch itself was a whole undertaking. To achieve that rigid, glossy finish, collars were treated, pressed, and shaped with real skill until they held their form like small architectural features attached to a man's neck. The result looked sharp and disciplined, exactly the impression a respectable gentleman wished to give. It also meant that turning your head became a careful manoeuvre, and a long day in a tall, stiff collar left many a man quietly longing to tear the thing off the moment he got home. There was real money sense in the system too. Laundering was costly, whether you paid a laundress or kept a servant busy with it, and shirts were not cheap. By washing only the small, quick-drying collars and cuffs frequently, and the bulky shirts less often, a household stretched its resources and its labour much further. A man of modest means could present a convincingly immaculate front on a budget, so long as nobody insisted on inspecting his shirt in full. And present a front he did, because the whole point was appearance. In a world that read character from cleanliness, a fresh white collar said reliable, respectable, in control. It did not matter that the shirt beneath had seen better days, because the shirt beneath was nobody's business. The collar was the face the world saw, and the face was kept spotless while the rest was allowed to be human. There is something almost honest about the dishonesty of it. Everyone knew, on some level, that the gleaming collar was doing the heavy lifting, and everyone played along, because everyone was doing the same thing. It was a shared, polite fiction, a whole society agreeing to judge each other only by the edges and never to check the middle. Framing the face at the collar was only half the finishing touch, though. Down at the ends of the arms, another small garment was busy sending its own careful signals about who you were and what you did. So let's turn to the hands, and the near-sacred Victorian rules about gloves. Now, your hands. In polite Victorian society, a bare hand in public is very nearly scandalous. Gloves are worn indoors, outdoors, to visit, to dance, to shop, and simply to exist near other people. They keep your skin pale and soft, hiding any hint that you might have done something as coarse as manual labour. A lady may change her gloves several times in a single day, and somewhere out there is a person whose entire livelihood is helping other people push tiny buttons through tiny loops, and honestly, fair enough. The bare hand was a surprisingly loaded thing. Hands tell the truth about a life, showing calluses, chapping, stains, and the rough marks of work. All the evidence a careful reputation was trying to hide. Covering them in smooth, clean gloves, erased that evidence at a stroke, presenting to the world a pair of hands that had clearly never scrubbed a pot or gripped a spade. To go gloveless was to expose the honest state of your hands, and honesty, in this arena, was not always flattering. Gloves also kept the skin pale and soft, and pale, soft skin was itself a status symbol. A tan meant you laboured outdoors in the sun, and rough red hands meant you laboured with them. So protecting your skin from both was a way of protecting your claim to a life of leisure. The glove was armour against the very idea of work. It said quietly that these hands were kept for gentler things, for holding teacups and calling cards, and the occasional decorative fan. The rules around when and what to wear were dizzying. There were gloves for day and gloves for evening, gloves for walking and gloves for dancing, in different lengths, materials and colours for different times and occasions. A ball called for long, fine gloves. A morning walk called for something sturdier. Knowing the correct glove for the correct moment was part of being properly bred, and getting it wrong marked you as someone who did not know the code. It was an entire etiquette, worn on the hands. This meant a great deal of changing. Because gloves soiled easily and different settings demanded different pairs, a well-off person might change gloves several times across a single day, peeling off one immaculate pair and drawing on another as the occasion shifted. Owning that many pairs and keeping them all clean was itself a small announcement of wealth. The poor could dream of one decent pair, the rich went through them like handkerchiefs. Fine gloves were often maddeningly tight, fitted close to the hand and fastened with a row of tiny buttons at the wrist, so small they defied ordinary fingers. Getting into them was a delicate operation, sometimes requiring a little hook to coax each button through and a servant or a patient companion to help. The snug fit looked elegant and refined, and it also meant that once your gloves were on, doing anything remotely practical was cheerfully out of the question, which, once again, was rather the point. Even removing them had its manners. There were moments when gloves stayed on, and moments when they came off, at the dinner table for instance, and doing it gracefully without a struggle was part of the performance. Nothing undercut an air of effortless refinement quite like wresting a stubborn glove off a damp hand in front of company. So gloves did far more than cover the hands. They hid your labour, guarded your status, displayed your wealth, and proved your grasp of the rules, all at once. Bare hands told the truth, and gloves politely refused to. From the hands, the eye travels naturally upward, to the head, where another garment ruled with its own strict set of laws. So let's talk about the bonnet. You cannot possibly go outside with your head uncovered. That would be practically indecent. So on goes the bonnet, tied beneath the chin, framing your face like a polite little curtain and shielding you from both the sun and the judgment of strangers. The style, the trimmings, the ribbons all speak volumes about your status and your grasp of the current fashion. A dowdy bonnet marks you as sadly behind the times. A daring one risks marking you as something rather worse. The rule itself was near absolute. A respectable woman covered her head in public, and to step out bareheaded was to invite exactly the sort of attention no respectable woman wanted. The bonnet was not optional weather gear. It was part of being properly dressed at all, as essential as shoes. Leaving the house without it would have felt, to a Victorian woman, roughly like a modern person realising halfway down the street that they had forgotten to put on trousers. The bonnet framed the face in a very particular way, its sides often rising close around the cheeks so that the wearer's view forward was narrowed and her face was partly shielded from those beside her. This suited the era's ideas about feminine modesty rather neatly, keeping a woman's gaze forward and her expression a little private. It was a garment that quietly enforced a certain demureness, guiding both how she saw the world and how much of her the world got to see. Its decoration was where the real conversation happened. Ribbons, flowers, feathers, lace and trimmings turned a plain shape into a personal statement, and the quality and fashionableness of those details announced both taste and money. A bonnet trimmed in fine materials and cut to the current mode showed a woman keeping up, while a plain, dated or worn one told the world she could not or did not follow the fashion. The head became a small tilted advertisement for one's standing. Fashion in bonnets moved as fashion does, and keeping pace was a genuine expense. Shapes shifted over the years, sitting further back on the head or perching at different angles, and trimmings went in and out of favour. A woman of means could refresh her bonnet or its decorations to stay current, while a woman without had to make an old one last, perhaps retrimming it herself to fake a newness the budget could not truly afford. The knowing eye could usually tell the difference. There was also the simple matter of protection. Beneath all the signalling, the bonnet did shield the face from the sun, helping preserve that prize-pale complexion, and offered some cover from rain and wind. It was practical and symbolic at once, keeping both the weather and the wrong impression at bay. Function and fashion sat together on the same brim, as they so often did in this world. For poorer women, the bonnet still mattered, though it came in humbler forms, plainer shapes and cheaper trimmings, or a simple covering that met the demand for a covered head without the expense of high fashion. Even at the bottom of the ladder, going out meant covering up, because the rule applied to everyone even when the finery did not. Respectability was expected of all, only the trimmings were reserved for those who could pay. So the bonnet did its quiet double duty, guarding the complexion and the reputation, while broadcasting taste and status to anyone who cared to look. It was modesty, fashion and class all tied neatly under the chin. Now a woman's head had its bonnet, but a man's head answered to an entirely different authority, one taller, glossier, and considerably more full of itself. So let's talk about the top hat. For the gentleman, the crowning glory, quite literally, is the top hat. Tall, glossy, and gravely impractical, it exists almost entirely to make a statement. The finer the hat, the finer the man, or at the very least the finer the man's bank account. It must be lifted to greet ladies, doffed to superiors, and balanced through doorways with the care of a man carrying his own dignity on his head. Which, in a very real sense, he absolutely is. The top hat was, above all, a matter of presence. It added height, drew the eye upward, and lent even an ordinary man a certain gravity, the visual equivalent of standing up straight and clearing your throat before you speak. To wear one well was to command a little extra respect simply by existing at a greater altitude. Height, it turns out, has always been quietly persuasive, and the top hat sold it by the inch. The finest examples had a deep mirror-like gloss, achieved on the best hats through a fur finish, brushed and polished to a rich sheen that caught the light. That shine was the mark of a quality hat, and a quality hat was expensive, so the gleam on a man's head was money made visible. A dull, battered or shabby topper by contrast gave the game away, telling everyone the wearer could not afford or could not maintain the real thing. The hat you wore was a headline about your finances. Wearing it came with a thick rule book. The top hat was constantly being lifted, tipped, or removed in the endless choreography of Victorian manners. You raised it to greet a lady, removed it indoors, doffed it to your betters, and handled it just so at every social turn. Knowing precisely when the hat came off and when it stayed on was part of being a gentleman, and fumbling the etiquette marked you as someone unschooled in the finer points. It was politeness performed at head height. It was also gloriously impractical, and that impracticality was half its charm. A tall, stiff hat is easily knocked, awkward in the wind, and a genuine consideration in low doorways and crowded carriages. It demanded care and attention, and a man who wore one had to move with a certain deliberate awareness of the thing perched above him. Like the widest crinoline, its very inconvenience was a quiet boast, declaring that the wearer's life had room for such fussy, useless elegance. The material and shape carried their own finer distinctions, understood by those who cared to notice. There were hats for formal occasions and hats for less, subtle variations in height and finish that the knowing eye could read. A man deeply versed in these matters could place another man's standing and taste from his hat alone, before a single word passed between them. It was another dialect in the endless language of clothes. Even at the humbler end, headwear told its tale. The labouring man wore his cap, sturdy and practical and entirely honest about his place, and no one confused a flat cap with a gleaming topper. The hat, more than almost any other single item, sorted men at a glance into their stations, from the workman's cap to the gentleman's shining crown. You could rank a whole street by what sat on the heads walking down it. So the top hat was far more than protection from the rain. It was height, gloss, manners, and money balanced precariously atop a man who understood exactly what it said about him. Beneath the hat, of course, came the coat, and the coat obeyed rules so exacting they could trip a man before breakfast. So let's talk about the frock coat. Beneath the hat, the gentleman is governed by a rule book of coats so precise it borders on cruelty. There is a coat for morning and a coat for evening, a coat for business and a coat for leisure, and wearing the wrong one at the wrong hour is a small but genuine social crime. The frock coat, long and sober, is the daytime uniform of the respectable man. Get every detail right, and you vanish comfortably into the crowd. Get them wrong, and you become the thing everyone politely refuses to mention. The frock coat itself was a dignified garment, cut to fit closely through the body with a full skirt that fell to around the knee, giving the wearer a long, upright, serious silhouette. It was the coat of business and of standing, worn by the professional man, the man of affairs, the man who wished to be taken seriously. To put one on was to armour yourself in respectability, to announce that you were a person of substance going about substantial things. What made the whole system so exacting was the sheer number of rules attached to it. Different coats belonged to different hours and different occasions, and a well-dressed man was expected to know them all instinctively. There was a proper coat for the daytime and another for the evening, one for formal calls and another for quieter pursuits, and the man who mixed them up revealed himself as someone who did not truly understand how things were done. The rules were unwritten and merciless. Fit was everything. A gentleman's coat was ideally tailored to his exact body, cut and shaped by a skilled hand so that it sat cleanly across the shoulders and closed neatly at the front. A well-fitted coat looked effortless and expensive. An ill-fitting one, loose here or straining there, looked cheap no matter the cloth. The difference between bespoke tailoring and something bought ready-made was visible to the trained eye, and the trained eye was, as ever, everywhere. The details did quiet, constant work. The set of the shoulders, the line of the lapel, the cut of the skirt, the choice of buttons, all combined to place a man precisely. None of it shouted because shouting was vulgar, but all of it spoke. A gentleman's day wear was an exercise in sober restraint, dark and understated, where correctness mattered far more than flair. The goal was not to stand out but to fit in perfectly, which is a far harder trick than it sounds. This restraint was itself the point. The Victorian gentleman was not meant to dazzle. He was meant to look correct, controlled, and quietly established. A man so at ease in the rules that he no longer had to think about them. Flashiness suggested the newly rich or the poorly bred, while true standing showed itself in getting every detail exactly, invisibly right. Vanishing seamlessly into the ranks of the respectable was the whole ambition. For the man who could not afford a tailor, the challenge was steep. Ready-made and second-hand coats existed, but they rarely fit as well, and the difference told. A working man in his best coat might look perfectly decent, yet a knowing observer could still read the compromises in the cut. The coat, like everything else, quietly sorted the man who commanded a tailor from the man who took what he could get. So the frock coat and its many cousins made the respectable man, dressing him in a uniform of dark, exacting correctness that demanded knowledge as much as money. It was a language of coats, and fluency was mandatory. Yet within all that sober restraint there was one small place where a man was permitted a flicker of personality. So let's talk about the waistcoat. In an endless sea of sober black and grey, the waistcoat is where a Victorian gentleman is quietly permitted to have feelings. Here, and almost nowhere else, a bit of colour, a patterned silk, a modest embroidered flourish is allowed without raising eyebrows. It peeks out from beneath the coat like a small, private rebellion, hinting that beneath all that stern respectability lives a man who once, briefly, enjoyed something. It is not much freedom, admittedly, but in this wardrobe you take what you can get. The waistcoat sat between the shirt and the coat, its front on display whenever the coat fell open, a neat panel of fabric right at the centre of a man's chest. Because it showed but did not dominate, it could carry a little more interest than the dark, disciplined coat around it. Here a man might indulge in a richer colour, a woven pattern, a touch of fine embroidery, small pleasures that would have been unthinkable spread across an entire coat. It was decoration kept safely within bounds. That containment was exactly what made it acceptable. A gentleman drenched head to toe in bright colour would have looked absurd or worse, common, but a single tasteful waistcoat added a note of individuality without breaking the rules of restraint. It was a controlled flourish, a permitted flourish, the one square of canvas on which a respectable man could paint a little of himself. Even his self-expression, it seems, came neatly framed and buttoned in. The waistcoat still had to be judged carefully, of course, because taste governed everything. A rich, well-chosen silk in a fine pattern spoke of quiet elegance and money spent well, while something too loud or too gaudy tipped over into vulgarity and undid the whole effect. The trick was to be interesting without being showy, distinctive without being obvious. It was a narrow line to walk, and walking it well was itself a mark of breeding. For evening and formal occasions the rules tightened again, often calling for particular colours and finer materials suited to the grandeur of the moment. There were waistcoats for the daytime and waistcoats for the evening, humbler ones for ordinary wear and splendid ones for display, each matched to its proper setting. Even this small pocket of freedom came with its own schedule, its own etiquette, its own right and wrong. The Victorians could not leave anything entirely to whim. The garment did practical work too, adding a warming layer beneath the coat and providing that essential small pocket in which a man kept his watch. Function and vanity shared the same piece of cloth, as they so often did, so that the one place a gentleman expressed a little personality was also busy keeping him warm and holding his timepiece. Nothing in this wardrobe was ever allowed to be purely decorative if it could be made to earn its keep. Even at more modest levels of society, the waistcoat played its cheerful part, letting a working or middling man add a touch of colour or pattern to an otherwise plain outfit. It was a small, affordable way to feel a little finer, a little more himself without pretending to a station he did not hold. In a world of rigid dress, it was one of the few garments that welcomed a bit of character across every rank. So the humble waistcoat carried a surprising weight of meaning. It was warmth, storage, taste, and the single sanctioned outlet for a man's personality, all buttoned neatly across his chest. And tucked into that waistcoat on the end of a gleaming chain sat a small object that said as much about a man as anything he wore. So let's talk about the pocket watch. Draped across that waistcoat you will very often find a gleaming chain, and dangling from it, a pocket watch. This is a good deal more than a way to tell the time. It is a portable advertisement. The gold of the chain, the weight of the watch, and the casual way a man draws it out to check the hour all announce that he is punctual, prosperous, and important enough to have places to be. Time, in Victorian England, is money, and this is simply you wearing both at once. The watch itself was a fine and often costly object, a small marvel of engineering carried in the pocket and drawn out with a practised flourish. A quality timepiece, particularly in gold, represented real money, and displaying it was a way of wearing your wealth in miniature. Unlike a coat or a hat, which merely suggested your means, a good watch put a specific and impressive sum right there at the end of a chain for the knowing to admire. The chain, stretched across the front of the waistcoat, was designed precisely to be seen. It secured the watch against loss, yes, but it also drew the eye to the whole arrangement, turning a practical object into a piece of display. A heavy gold chain glinting against a fine waistcoat was a deliberate statement, and everyone understood that it was meant to be noticed. Nothing about its placement was accidental. It was jewellery for men in an age that frowned on men wearing jewellery. Then there was the gesture, the small performance of checking the time. Drawing out the watch, opening it, glancing at the hour and returning it to the pocket was a ritual loaded with meaning, suggesting a man with appointments, obligations, and a schedule that mattered. To consult your watch was to imply that your time was valuable and your day was full of important things. Whether it truly was hardly mattered. The gesture did the talking. This mattered so much because the era prized punctuality and order as marks of good character. A respectable man kept his appointments, valued his time, and ran his affairs with discipline, and the watch was the very symbol of that ideal. Carrying one announced that you belonged to the busy, ordered, productive world of business and standing, not the vague and idle drift of those with nowhere in particular to be. The watch was also, very often, a treasured possession with a history. Fine timepieces were passed from father to son, given to mark milestones, and kept for a lifetime so that a man's watch might carry sentiment as well as status. It could be at once a proud display of wealth and a private link to family, a public boast and a personal keepsake ticking quietly against the chest. Few objects managed to be so showy and so intimate at the same time. For men of lesser means, watches still held their appeal in humbler materials and simpler forms because the desire to own one and to display that small badge of order and prosperity ran right down the social scale. A modest watch on a modest chain was a genuine source of pride, a taste of the respectability that finer men wore in gold. The object meant something at every level, only the metal changed. So the pocket watch and its chain did far more than measure the hours. They advertised wealth, signalled discipline, performed importance, and sometimes carried love, all from the small space of a waistcoat pocket. From the chest, the reading eye eventually made its way all the way down to the ground, where a man or woman's footwear quietly finished the story. So let's talk about boots. Now look down, because your footwear is telling on you too. Neat, well-made button boots, polished to a soft shine, suggest comfort and care. Cracked, worn, mud-caked shoes with soles gasping their final breath say something very different indeed. Fastening those endless little buttons requires a special hook and a great deal of patience, which is fine if you happen to own a servant or an entire free morning. Your feet may well ache either way, but at least the wealthy get to ache in style. Boots were the fashionable footwear of the era, rising above the ankle and often fastened with a long row of small buttons up the side, snug and elegant and a genuine trial to put on. Well-made ones in good leather, fitted properly and kept polished, spoke of money and care, finishing an outfit with the same quiet correctness as a clean collar or a fine hat. The foot, so easily overlooked, was in fact one more place the whole system kept score. The condition of your footwear was a particularly honest witness. Shoes and boots take a beating from the ground, and the ground in a Victorian city was a grim mix of mud, filth, and worse, so keeping footwear clean and whole demanded constant effort. Gleaming, well-repaired boots said someone tended to them faithfully, while cracked, filthy, broken-soled shoes confessed hardship no fine coat above them could disguise. You could read a person's whole situation in the state of their soles. Those side buttons were their own small ordeal. There were often a great many of them, fiddly and close together, far too small for ordinary fingers to manage easily, which is why a special little tool, the button hook, existed for the sole purpose of dragging each one through its loop. Fastening a pair of boots this way took real time and patience, and the wealthy, naturally, had servants to do it, or leisure to spare. For everyone else, it was one more slow chore standing between them and the front door. Polishing was a ritual in itself. A proper shine took blacking, brushes and effort, and a mirror finish on a pair of boots was a sign that someone, somewhere, had put in the work. In grand households, this fell to servants, so that a gentleman simply stepped into gleaming boots each morning without a thought for how they got that way. The shine on his feet, like the white at his collar, rested on invisible labour he never had to see. Comfort, meanwhile, was often an afterthought. Fashionable footwear was not always kind to the foot, cut narrow or shaped for looks rather than ease, and a long day in stiff boots left many limping quietly toward a chair. But looking correct outranked feeling comfortable at every turn, so aching feet were simply part of the price of appearing respectable. If it hurt, at least it hurt fashionably, which the era seemed to regard as a fair trade. For the labouring poor, footwear was a matter of survival before style. A stout pair of boots to protect the feet through hard, wet, filthy work, mended and mended again until they finally fell apart. Some had barely adequate shoes at all, and worn or ill-fitting footwear made every long day on the feet harder still. At the bottom of the ladder, the question was not whether your boots were fashionable, but whether they held together at all. So footwear closed the outfit and told its own plain truth. From the gleaming buttoned boots of the comfortable to the broken shoes of the struggling, the ground kept honest accounts. Now all this daily finery, the collars and coats and boots, was one thing. But for a great many people, real dress was reserved for a single sacred outfit. So let's talk about the Sunday best. For a great many people, the whole dazzling game of fashion comes down to a single outfit, the Sunday best. This is the one good set of clothes, carefully saved, gently worn and fiercely protected, brought out for church, for weddings, for funerals, and for any moment that truly matters. The rest of the week you wear whatever survives the work. But on a Sunday, you become, for a few precious hours, the most respectable version of yourself that you own, and you make every minute of it count. For most working people, owning a large wardrobe was simply out of the question. Clothing was expensive and hard use wore it out fast, so the everyday reality was a few well-worn garments kept going as long as possible, patched and mended and never quite clean. Against that background, a single set of good clothes held aside for special occasions was a genuine treasure, a small island of dignity in a hard-working life. The Sunday best earned its name from the day it was most reliably worn, for church, where the whole community gathered and everyone saw everyone else. Sunday was the great weekly appearance, the moment to be seen at your finest, and turning up decently dressed was both a mark of respect and a matter of self-respect. In front of neighbours and God alike, you wanted to look like someone who kept up standards, whatever the week had thrown at you. Protecting the outfit was a serious business. The good clothes were kept carefully, worn only when they had to be, and changed out of the moment the occasion ended so they might last for years. A person might come home from church and immediately swap the good clothes for the everyday ones, folding the finery away for next time. That single suit or dress was an investment, and it was guarded accordingly because there was no replacing it on a whim. It carried the family through every important moment. The same good outfit that graced the church pew appeared at weddings, at christenings, at funerals, at every event that called for looking one's best. It witnessed the milestones of a life, worn for the joys and the sorrows alike, until it became bound up with the memory of those occasions. One set of clothes could hold a surprising amount of a person's history in its seams. The Sunday best also let ordinary people taste, however briefly, the respectability that finer folk wore every day. In their good clothes, working people could stand a little straighter, feel a little more equal, and present themselves to the world with pride. It was a democratic little slice of dignity, a way of insisting that decency and self-worth were not the exclusive property of the rich. For a few hours the gap narrowed. Of course, a knowing eye could often still tell. The Sunday best of a poor family, however carefully kept, was rarely the equal of a wealthy person's everyday wear, and details of cut, cloth and freshness could give it away. But that scarcely diminished its meaning to the wearer, for whom it represented real sacrifice and real pride. What it cost to own and to keep only made it matter more. So the Sunday best stood as the humble counterpart to all the era's high fashion, proof that the longing to look respectable ran through every rank, and that dignity could be stitched into a single well-guarded outfit. Among the solemn occasions that called for the very best a person owned, one stood apart in its rules and its weight, and that was the death of someone loved. So let's turn gently to mourning dress. Now we come to death, which in Victorian England carried a very strict dress code of its own. When someone died, the family did not simply feel their sorrow. They dressed the part, head to toe, in black. Mourning was an entire language of fabric, worn openly so that the world knew at a glance exactly what a household had lost. There was nothing casual or private about grief here. It was formal, it was public, and it was worn on the body for all to see. Death was a constant and familiar presence in Victorian life. Illness, accident, and hard living took people of all ages, and few families were spared repeated loss. So the rituals surrounding death were deeply woven into daily life. Out of this closeness with mortality grew an elaborate and serious culture of mourning, and clothing sat at its very heart, giving shape and visible form to grief in a way the age found meaningful and proper. The colour of mourning was black, deep and complete, worn over the whole body for a set period after a death. To put on mourning was to announce a loss without speaking of it, to carry sorrow openly so that others would know and respond with care. It told neighbours, acquaintances and strangers alike that this person was grieving, and it asked, in effect, for the gentleness and consideration that a bereaved person was owed. The clothing did the difficult work of saying what was hard to say aloud. The rules were detailed and taken seriously. There were expectations about how deep the black should be, what materials were fitting, how long the mourning should last, and how it might gradually ease over time, and all of it varied according to how close the loss had been. Mourning for a distant relative asked less than mourning for one held dear, and the closer the tie, the fuller and longer the black. Grief, in this system, was given a recognised outward form, measured and observed. There was real feeling beneath the formality. It would be a mistake to see mourning dress as mere social theatre, for behind the rules lay genuine sorrow, and the customs gave people a way to carry it. Dressing in mourning offered a structure to lean on in the rawest days, a shared and understood way to grieve, and a signal to the world to tread softly. In an age well acquainted with loss, these rituals were a kind of comfort, a framework holding people up when they most needed it. Mourning also placed a real burden on families, particularly those of modest means. Providing the required black clothing on top of the costs of a death and a funeral was a heavy expense, and yet the pressure to observe the customs properly was strong. To fail to mourn correctly risked seeming to disrespect the dead, so families stretched what they had to meet the expectation, sometimes at genuine cost. Grief in this world came with a bill attached, and it fell hardest on those least able to pay. The wider culture surrounding all this was vast, encompassing not only clothing but the whole apparatus of a Victorian funeral and its observances. Mourning dress was the most visible thread in a much larger fabric of ritual, one that gave death a central and dignified place in the life of the community. Whatever its costs and its strictness, it reflected a society that took loss seriously and refused to let it pass unmarked. So mourning dress was grief made visible, a shared language of black that honoured the dead and guided the living through sorrow. It was demanding and costly, and for all that, deeply human. Within this world of mourning, one figure bore its heaviest and longest demands of all, and that was the widow. So let's turn to the long black road she was expected to walk. For a widow, the rules were heaviest of all. She was expected to spend a long stretch of time in the deepest black, wrapped in dull, dark fabric with no shine, no ornament, and no relief, in a costume so recognisable it had earned its own name, widow's weeds. Only slowly, over many months and years, was she permitted to ease back toward grey, then muted colour, then ordinary life. Her clothing marked the passage of her mourning as plainly as any calendar, whether or not her heart chose to keep the same schedule. The widow occupied a special and demanding place in the culture of mourning. Where others might wear black for a set period and then return to their lives, a woman who had lost her husband was expected to mourn most deeply and for longest, carrying her loss on her body for a very long time. The customs asked more of her than of anyone, and society watched to see that she met them. Her grief was, in effect, held to a public standard. The deepest stage was the starkest. In the first and heaviest period, a widow wore dull black cloth chosen precisely for its lack of shine, avoiding anything that gleamed or decorated or lifted the eye. The dullness was deliberate, a visible statement that she had withdrawn from the ordinary pleasures of dress and of life while her sorrow was rawest. She was, in a sense, meant to disappear into her grief, and her clothing made that withdrawal plain for all to see. Over time, the rules allowed a slow easing. As the months and then the years passed, a widow was gradually permitted to soften her mourning, moving from the deepest black toward fabrics that might carry a little more finish, and eventually toward greys and muted shades before any return to fuller colour. This gradual lightening followed an understood timetable, so that a person could look at a widow and read roughly how long ago her loss had fallen. Her dress charted her sorrow like the hands of a clock moving slowly forward. There was genuine feeling honoured in all this, and it deserves acknowledging. For many women, the long observance gave form to a real and heavy grief, a recognised way to carry the loss of a partner and to have that loss seen and respected by others. The customs offered structure in a time of upheaval, and the visible mourning drew the care and consideration of the community. In its intention, it was a way of holding a grieving woman within the concern of those around her. Yet the weight of it fell unevenly, and often hardest on those with the least. Maintaining the required mourning dress for years was a real expense, and a widow was frequently a woman whose circumstances had just been thrown into uncertainty by the loss of a husband and perhaps his income. To meet the costly demands of proper mourning while facing sudden hardship was a cruel double burden, and the pressure to observe the forms remained strong regardless of means. The rules did not soften for poverty. There was, too, a quiet unfairness in how much more was asked of women than of men in their grief. A widower's obligations were far lighter and far shorter, and the long, exacting road of mourning belonged chiefly to the widow. Her sorrow was the one held to the strictest and most visible standard, whatever the private truth of anyone's heart. So the widow's weed stood as the heaviest expression of the era's mourning culture, a black testament to loss, demanding, costly, and worn most faithfully by those given the least choice in the matter. From the end of a marriage, let's turn to its hopeful beginning, and the young woman dressed expressly to bring one about. So let's talk about the debutante. At the other end of life stands the young woman being presented to society, and her wardrobe has a very particular job to do: help find her a husband. Pale, delicate colours signal youth and innocence. Fine fabrics signal a family worth marrying into. Every gown at every ball is quietly working, advertising her suitability to a room full of appraising eyes. She may believe she's simply dancing. In truth, she is on display, dressed to sell a future she's been given remarkably little say in. The season, as it was known among the well-off, was the great annual round of balls, parties, and social gatherings at which young people of marriageable age were brought together under the watchful eyes of their families. A young woman making her entrance into this world was being formally launched onto what was, in plain terms, a marriage market, and her clothing was her chief tool for making a good impression. She was, in effect, being introduced to prospective husbands, and dressed for exactly that purpose. Her gowns leaned toward light, delicate colours, the pale shades associated with youth, freshness, and innocence. Softer tones suited an unmarried girl and set her apart from the richer, deeper colours a married woman might wear, marking her clearly as new to society and available. The whole palette was chosen to say young, pure and eligible, a visual shorthand that everyone in the room understood at once. Colour did the introducing before a single dance began. The quality of her dress spoke for her family as much as for herself. Fine fabrics, elegant cut, and fashionable trimming announced that she came from a household of means and standing, a family worth allying with through marriage. A prospective husband and his relations were, after all, weighing not just the girl but the connection, and her wardrobe testified to what that connection was worth. Behind every carefully chosen gown stood a family making its case. The stakes were high, because so much of a young woman's future turned on the match she made. Marriage shaped a woman's whole life, her security, her standing, her prospects, and a good match could raise a family's fortunes while a poor one could disappoint them. The gowns, the balls, the whole glittering performance were bent toward this serious end, however light and pleasant they appeared on the surface. Beneath the music and the dancing ran a current of real and consequential business. The young woman herself often had strikingly little control over the process. Dressed by her family, guided by her mother, and presented according to plans laid on her behalf, she was frequently more the object of the exercise than its author. Her preferences carried limited weight against the practical calculations of a good marriage, and the beautiful clothes she wore served purposes decided largely by others. She was adorned for a transaction in which she was the central figure and yet rarely the one in charge. For families lower down the social scale, versions of the same drama played out with humbler means, as parents did their best to present marriageable daughters well within a modest budget. The desire to see a daughter suitably matched, and the use of the best clothing one could manage to help her along, ran through many levels of society. The finery differed, but the underlying purpose was widely shared. So the debutante's wardrobe was fashion pressed into the service of matchmaking, every pale gown and fine trimming quietly working toward a future the wearer had little hand in shaping. Now, if grown women and men were bound by these codes, spare a thought for the smallest members of the household, dressed as miniature adults from the start. So let's talk about children's clothing. Spare a thought for the children, bundled into miniature versions of grown-up clothing and expected to behave accordingly. Small girls wore their own little corsets and layers. Small boys were dressed in gowns and skirts when very young, then marked their arrival into boyhood by finally being put into trousers, a proper milestone with a proper name. Childhood comfort was not really the priority of the age. Looking like a neat, respectable small adult, however, very much was. The Victorian idea of childhood dress was shaped by the same concern for respectability that governed everything else, so children will often turn out to resemble little adults rather than to run about in comfort. Their clothes echoed the styles of their elders, scaled down but not loosened, so that even the young carried the marks of their family's standing on their small frames. From an early age, a child was already a walking statement about the household that produced it. Girls, in particular, were introduced early to the layered, structured dressing that would rule their lives, including light forms of the supportive garments their mothers wore. The training in fashionable shape and proper dress began young, preparing them for the demands of adult womanhood well before they reached it. It was, in a sense, an apprenticeship in appearance, teaching girls from childhood that looking correct was simply part of being a respectable female person. Very young boys occupied a curious in-between place, dressed in gowns and skirts much like their sisters during their earliest years. In an age before easy laundering and with practical needs in mind, this made a certain sense, and small boys and girls could look quite alike while very young. To modern eyes it seems strange to see little boys in skirts, but at the time it was ordinary and unremarkable, simply how the youngest children were dressed. The passage out of skirts and into trousers was a genuine milestone, an event with its own name and its own significance. When a boy was judged old enough, he was put into trousers for the first time, a change that marked his step away from babyhood and toward boyhood proper. It was a small rite of passage, a visible graduation in cloth, celebrated as a sign that the child was growing up. Clothing, once again, marked a stage of life as clearly as any words. Comfort and freedom of movement, meanwhile, ranked well below appearance in the order of priorities. Children's clothes, like adults, prized looking correct over feeling easy, so the young were often dressed in fussy, restrictive outfits that a child running and playing today would find baffling. The notion that children's clothing should above all let them move and play freely was not the guiding idea it later became. Small bodies were fitted to the standards of respectability, not the other way around. Class ran through children's dress as thoroughly as through everything else. The well-off child appeared in fine, fashionable little outfits that advertised the family's wealth, while poorer children wore simpler, sturdier, often handed-down clothing suited to harder circumstances. A child's clothes placed its family at a glance, just as an adult's did, so that even the youngest were sorted by cloth into their stations. There was no age too young to be read. So Victorian children were dressed as small reflections of the adult world, their clothing training them, marking their milestones, and announcing their family's standing, all long before they could have any say in the matter. Now let's step out of the family and into the great houses that ran on hidden hands, and meet the people dressed expressly not to be noticed. So let's talk about servants. Now let's meet the people quietly keeping all this finery running. The servants, dressed not to stand out, but to disappear. A maid's plain dress, apron and cap were a uniform of usefulness, designed to be tidy, clean, and utterly unremarkable. Their clothing marked their place in the household as clearly as any spoken title. They were meant to be seen just enough to be summoned, and never so much as to be truly noticed. In a world obsessed with display, their whole job was to blend gently into the wallpaper. Behind every well-run Victorian household stood a staff of servants, and their appearance was carefully managed to fit their role. The typical maid wore a plain, practical dress in a modest colour, topped with an apron and a cap, an outfit built for work and for looking neat rather than for fashion or self-expression. It was a uniform in all but name, and it announced her position the moment she was seen. One glance sorted her instantly from the family she served. The plainness was entirely the point. A servant was not meant to draw attention or to compete in any way with the finery of the household's family and guests, so her dress was deliberately simple and unshowy. She was there to work, to serve, and to keep the machinery of the house running smoothly, and her clothing reflected that function above all. Anything more elaborate would have been out of place, even presumptuous, a stepping above her station that the whole system frowned upon. Cleanliness and neatness, however, were strictly required. A servant's plain dress had to be kept tidy and spotless, her apron fresh, her cap in place, because the appearance of the staff reflected directly on the household that employed them. A well-turned-out servant spoke of a well-run home, so while the clothing was humble, its upkeep was not optional. She was expected to be at once unremarkable and immaculate, a curious combination that summed up her whole position. The apron and cap did real work as markers of rank and role. Different positions within a large household might be distinguished by details of dress, so that the knowing eye could tell one kind of servant from another, and all of them from the family. The clothing formed a visible hierarchy, placing each person precisely within the elaborate order of a great house. Even below stairs, dress kept careful score of who stood where. There was a quiet hardship in being dressed to disappear. A servant spent her days in the midst of comfort and abundance that was not hers, clothed plainly so as not to intrude on a world she made possible but did not share. She was essential and yet meant to be overlooked, present everywhere and noticed nowhere. Her very uniform a reminder of the gulf between her life and the lives she tended. The invisibility asked of her was its own kind of weight. For the servant herself, the position still often represented respectable employment, a roof and steady work, and a clean, decent uniform was in its way a mark of a proper place in a proper house. Domestic service was a common path, particularly for young women, and the plain dress and apron signified belonging to an established household. There was dignity to be found in it, even within its limits. So the servant's plain dress was a uniform of usefulness and of invisibility, marking her role, reflecting on her employer, and quietly embodying the distance between those who served and those who were served. Not every servant, though, was dressed to vanish. Some were turned out expressly to be seen, as living advertisements of their master's wealth. So let's talk about livery. But some servants were dressed very much to be seen, and lavishly so. The grand footman in his fine livery, all bright coat, polished buttons, and on occasion powdered hair, was a walking advertisement for his employer's wealth. The finer the household, the finer the footman, because nothing says money quite like paying a tall man handsomely to open your door and look splendid doing it. His outfit was never really about him at all. He was a wearable boast standing very straight in the hall. Livery was the distinctive, often elaborate uniform worn by certain male servants in grander households, especially footmen, and it stood in sharp contrast to the plain, self-effacing dress of the ordinary maid. Where her clothing was designed to disappear, his was designed to impress, cut in fine fabric, trimmed with bright colour and gleaming buttons, and turned out to catch the eye. The footman was meant to be looked at, and his splendour reflected directly onto the family he served. The whole purpose of this finery was display. A household that could dress its footmen in rich livery was advertising its wealth and status through them, using the servants themselves as ornaments of the family's grandeur. The message was unmistakable. Here was a home so prosperous it could clothe even its staff in splendour and pay for the pleasure. The footman became a piece of the household's public image, a costly signal wearing a very fine coat. Certain touches pushed the effect further still. In the grandest establishments, footmen might wear powdered hair or other showy flourishes that served no earthly practical purpose beyond looking impressive. These deliberately impractical details were precisely the point, because uselessness was itself a form of boasting, declaring that the household could afford ornament for its own sake. The more pointless the splendour, the louder the statement of wealth behind it. Height and appearance could even factor into a footman's hiring. Tall, well-made men were prized for these visible roles, since they looked more striking in livery and lent greater grandeur to the household's public face. A pair of matched, imposing footmen at the door made a powerful impression, and employers were willing to pay for the effect. The servant's very body, as well as his coat, was pressed into the service of display. There is something quietly telling in the whole arrangement. The footman, however magnificent he appeared, was still a servant, and all his finery belonged to his role rather than to him. He was dressed grandly, not for his own honour, but for his employer's glory, a splendid instrument of someone else's vanity. His fine coat marked him as both elevated and owned, raised up in appearance precisely so that another's wealth could shine through him. For the man himself, a position as a liveried footman in a great house could be a relatively prized place, carrying a certain standing among servants and the dignity of a prominent role. To wear the fine livery of an important household was, in its way, to hold a visible and respectable position within the world of service. The splendour was not his own, yet the place could still be one worth having. So livery turned the servant into a showpiece, dressing him in costly, deliberately impractical finery, so that his master's wealth might walk about the house in human form and answer the door with a bow. Away from the great houses and their showpiece footmen, most people dressed themselves on far slenderer means, often in clothes that had already lived other lives. So let's talk about the second-hand trade. Down in the everyday world, most people could not so much as dream of new silk gowns or tailored coats, so they turned instead to a thriving trade in second-hand clothes. Garments passed down and down the social ladder, worn by one owner, then sold again, until the fine dress of a lady might well end its long life on the back of a woman who scrubbed floors for a living. There were whole bustling markets in used clothing, and for many being fashionable meant wearing someone else's fashion, several years too late. New clothing was simply beyond the reach of most working people. The cost of good fabric and skilled making put fresh, fashionable garments far out of the ordinary household's budget, so the everyday reality was to clothe oneself through other means. Chief among these was a vast and lively second-hand trade, a whole economy built on the buying, selling and passing along of used clothes. Around this trade grew markets, dealers, and traders who made their living moving garments from one owner to the next. Clothing tended to travel steadily downward through society over the course of its life. A wealthy person's cast-offs might be sold on, then sold again, descending step by step through the social ranks as each owner wore them a while and passed them along. A garment that began its life as the fine dress of a lady could, after several owners and several years, end up clothing someone doing the hardest and humblest of work. Each piece carried a quiet history of the hands it had passed through. Servants occupied an interesting spot in this flow, since they were sometimes given their employers' unwanted clothing, which they might wear, alter, or sell on for a little money. This was a recognised perk of certain positions, a small benefit that put decent garments within reach of people who could never have bought them new. Through such channels, good clothing trickled down from the wealthy to those who served them and beyond, feeding the wider second-hand market. For the buyer, second-hand clothing offered a way to dress with some measure of decency, and even a touch of fashion, however dated. Wearing a garment that had once belonged to a finer wardrobe let a working person approach respectability at a fraction of the cost, even if the styles were a season or several behind the times. Being fashionable for most people meant catching up slowly with the discarded fashions of those above them. The look was borrowed and late, but it was something. The trade was also a substantial and organised part of everyday economic life, not a marginal or shameful corner of it. Buying used clothes was simply how most people acquired much of their wardrobe, an ordinary and accepted practice rather than a mark of special hardship. The markets that supplied it were busy, established places, woven into the fabric of working life. There was nothing unusual in wearing what someone else had worn before. Still, the second-hand nature of these clothes could be read, and it placed the wearer as surely as any other signal. Dated styles, worn fabric, and alterations told the knowing eye that a garment had lived previous lives, quietly marking its owner's station. The clothes did their job of covering and even of aspiring, yet they rarely fooled anyone about where their wearer truly stood. The reading never stopped, even at the bottom of the ladder, so the second-hand trade clothed the great mass of ordinary people, passing garments down through the ranks and letting the working world dress itself in the fashions the wealthy had already left behind. At the very hardest edge of this world, even second-hand clothing became a thing to be pawned, patched, and clung to. So let's look plainly at what dress meant for the poorest. For the poorest, clothing was not a statement but a daily struggle. A single decent outfit might be pawned on a Monday to buy food, then redeemed on Saturday if the week had gone well, in an endless wearing cycle of make-do and hope. Clothes were patched, turned inside out, mended and worn far past the point of wearing out, because there was quite simply nothing else. Behind all the era's glittering talk of finery and fashion, this was the quiet reality for a great many, and it should never be lost beneath the ribbons and lace. At the bottom of society, clothing ceased to be about signalling status and became a matter of bare necessity. The poorest people owned very little, often only what they stood up in, and every garment had to be stretched as far as it could possibly go. There was no wardrobe to speak of, no choosing of outfits, only the daily problem of staying covered and warm with almost nothing to work with. Dress at this level was survival rather than expression. The pawnshop played a central and telling role in this struggle. For families living hand to mouth, a decent article of clothing was one of the few things of value they possessed, and so it could be pawned for a little money when times were hardest, then redeemed when a little came in. In some households, the good clothes made this journey to the pawnbroker and back with grim regularity, going in when money ran short and coming out again when wages allowed. Clothing became a kind of emergency currency, cycled through hardship week after week. Every garment was made to last far beyond its natural life. Clothes were patched where they wore through, mended again and again, and even turned inside out or remade to get more use from failing fabric. Nothing was discarded while any wear remained in it, because there was no money to replace it, so the poor became expert at coaxing life from cloth long past its prime. Making do was not a choice, but a constant, exhausting necessity. The consequences of having too little to wear were real and serious. Inadequate clothing meant genuine suffering in cold and wet weather, and worn, insufficient garments offered little protection against the elements or the hardships of labouring life. For people already stretched thin by poverty, the lack of decent clothing added another layer of difficulty to lives that had few comforts to begin with. What the well-off treated as fashion, the poor experienced as the difference between warmth and cold. There was, too, a quiet indignity in it that the era's obsession with appearances made sharper. In a society that read character and worth from clothing, those who could not dress respectably were marked out and judged, their poverty worn visibly for all to see. The very system that let the wealthy display their status also exposed the poor to constant unspoken assessment and found them wanting. Their clothes told a truth the world was quick to notice and slow to pity. Yet within these hard limits, people held on to what dignity they could. Keeping a single decent outfit for important occasions, mending with care and staying as clean and neat as circumstances allowed, were ways of preserving self-respect against difficult odds. Even with almost nothing, many worked to maintain a sense of decency, refusing to let poverty strip away their pride entirely. There was quiet strength in that effort, and it deserves recognition. So for the poorest, clothing was a daily test of endurance, pawned and patched and stretched to its limits, a struggle carried out beneath the glittering surface of an age that prized appearances above almost all else. Now let's turn to a very different anxiety, felt not by those with too little, but by those with suddenly rather a lot and unsure how to wear it. So let's talk about the newly rich. Now here is a delicious little trap. Having money was not nearly enough. You also had to wear it correctly. The newly rich, eager to display their fresh fortunes, often wore everything all at once. Too bright, too much, too obviously expensive, and the old-moneyed classes looked on with quiet, practised horror. True status, they firmly believed, was shown through restraint, through knowing which rules to follow and which to gently ignore. Overdo it, and your clothes did not announce your wealth. They announced that you had come by it only recently. The century created a good many new fortunes, as trade, industry and enterprise lifted families into wealth they had never before known. These newly prosperous people naturally wished to look the part, to dress in a way that reflected their improved circumstances and claim their place among the comfortable. And so they spent, often lavishly, on fine clothes and rich display, determined to show the world that they had arrived. The trouble was that arriving and belonging were not quite the same thing. The established wealthy classes had absorbed, over generations, an unspoken code about how money ought to be worn, and at the heart of that code sat restraint. To them, true good taste lay in understatement, in quiet quality, in knowing precisely how much was enough and stopping there. Wealth worn subtly, almost carelessly, was the mark of those long accustomed to it, people who no longer needed to prove anything. Their confidence showed in what they left off as much as in what they put on. The newly rich, by contrast, tended to err toward excess, and it gave them away. Eager to be seen as wealthy, they piled on the signs of it, choosing the brightest colours, the most obvious finery, the loudest display, in the belief that more must mean better. But to the practised eye, this abundance read not as wealth, but as anxiety, the visible effort of someone straining to prove a status they did not yet wear naturally. The very eagerness undid them. This gap between the two kinds of wealth was policed quietly but firmly. The old-moneyed set could spot the overdressed newcomer at a glance and file them accordingly, no matter how genuine or how large the fortune behind the finery. Money alone did not buy acceptance. One also had to demonstrate the taste, the knowledge, and the ease that supposedly came with breeding. The rules were subtle enough that only those raised among them truly knew them, which was, conveniently, rather the point. There was a certain snobbery baked into the whole business, of course. The insistence that wealth be worn just so served to keep the established classes distinct from the merely rich, drawing a line that money could not easily cross. It was a way of guarding status against the rising tide of new fortunes, of insisting that belonging required more than a full purse. Taste, in this sense, was a kind of gatekeeping dressed up as refinement. For the newly rich themselves, navigating this was a genuine and often frustrating challenge. Learning the unwritten rules, absorbing the preferred restraint, and shedding the habits that marked one as new could take time, effort, and no small humiliation along the way. Some managed it, easing into the manners of the established over years or generations. Others never quite escaped the telltale signs of trying too hard, forever a little too bright for the room. So the nouveau riche faced their own peculiar trial, discovering that a fortune was only the beginning, and that wearing wealth correctly was a skill the old guard guarded jealously behind a wall of quiet, merciless taste. Beyond the clothes themselves, a whole array of small objects finished the picture and carried their own signals. So, let's talk about accessories. Beyond the clothes themselves lived a whole quiet arsenal of accessories, each one busily working. A parasol shielded a fashionable pale complexion from the vulgar suggestion of a labourer's tan. A fan cooled the face, and, some like to claim, carried little coded signals all its own. A small reticule, a carefully chosen brooch, a crisp calling card. Every object had a job to do, and that job was almost always to say something about you that you were far too polite to say out loud. Accessories completed the Victorian outfit and extended its language into a host of small, carefully chosen objects. Far from being mere afterthoughts, these items were part of the whole careful presentation of the self, each one selected to suit the occasion and to reflect the taste and standing of its owner. A well-appointed person carried the right things as surely as they wore the right clothes, and the details mattered just as much down here as they did in the cut of a coat. The parasol was a fine example of function and signal working together. It shielded a lady's face and skin from the sun, helping to preserve the pale complexion so prized as a mark of a life spent away from outdoor labour. A tan spoke of working in the fields or the sun, so guarding against it was a way of guarding one's claim to gentility. The parasol thus did double duty, offering shade while quietly defending its owner's status against the vulgar hint of a suntan. The fan carried its own mystique, both practical and social. It cooled the face in warm, crowded rooms, and it also became bound up with notions of flirtation and signalling, with tales that particular gestures could send secret messages across a room. How much of this coded language of the fan was ever a real and agreed system, and how much was charming embellishment, is genuinely uncertain, and it is fair to treat the more elaborate claims with a raised eyebrow. Still, the fan was undeniably an object of flirtation and expression, whatever the truth of its supposed codes. Smaller items each played their part in the whole. A reticule, the little bag a lady carried, held her few necessities in an age when dresses offered no pockets to speak of. A brooch or other modest piece of jewellery added a permitted touch of adornment, and could speak of taste or sentiment. Even the calling card, that small printed slip left when visiting, was an object of careful etiquette, part of the elaborate rituals of social life. Each thing had its place and its meaning. Gloves, already met, belonged to this world of accessories too, alongside handkerchiefs, canes for gentlemen, and the various small objects that finished an outfit and marked its wearer. Together these items formed a complete language, a set of signals that supplemented the clothes and refined the message they sent. Nothing a well-dressed person carried was truly random. It all combined into a single, coherent statement of who they were and where they stood. The quality and appropriateness of one's accessories were read as closely as anything else. A fine parasol, an elegant fan, a tasteful brooch spoke of means and discernment, while cheap, worn or ill-chosen items undercut the impression the clothes were working to create. Getting the details right required both money and knowledge, and the knowing eye missed nothing. The smallest object could confirm or betray the whole performance, so the era's accessories were far more than trinkets. They shielded, adorned and communicated, extending the silent language of dress into every small thing a person carried, each one quietly saying what manners forbade speaking aloud. Underneath every gleaming accessory and spotless gown, though, lay an exhausting and invisible labour that made the whole clean, bright performance possible. So let's finish where the finery truly rested, with the laundry. And finally, the great invisible battle behind every spotless collar and gleaming gown, the laundry. In a city choked with coal smoke, keeping anything clean was brutal, back-breaking labour, mostly done by women bent for endless hours over tubs of scalding water. Clean, bright, well-kept clothing was therefore its own quiet luxury, proof that someone, somewhere, had done the exhausting work so that you didn't have to. Every pristine shirt in Victorian England rested in the end on a pair of aching, reddened hands. Washing clothes in this era was a genuinely gruelling undertaking, worlds away from the effortless press of a modern button. It meant hauling and heating great quantities of water, soaking, scrubbing and boiling garments, wringing them out by hand or through a mangle, and then drying and pressing them, all through hours of heavy, wet, physically punishing work. It was one of the hardest of household tasks, and it fell, overwhelmingly, to women. Laundry day was dreaded for good reason. The filthy air of the great cities made the battle harder still. Coal smoke and soot settled over everything, greying clean washing even as it dried and undoing the labour almost as fast as it was done. Keeping clothes truly clean and white in such conditions was a constant, near-hopeless fight against the very environment, demanding endless effort for results that would not last. The dirt was relentless, and so the work was never truly finished. Because clean clothing was so hard to achieve, it became a powerful marker of status in its own right. Bright, spotless, well-kept garments announced that their owner commanded the means to fight and win the war against dirt, whether by employing servants or by paying a laundress. The wealthy could keep their wardrobes immaculate because others did the labour for them, so cleanliness itself became a visible sign of comfort and standing. To be clean was quite literally to be able to afford to be. For those without such means, the struggle was personal and unending. A poor woman washed her family's clothes herself, on top of every other demand of a hard life, wrestling with the same brutal process and the same filthy air, but with far less to show for it. Keeping a family decently clean was an achievement wrung from exhaustion, and the results could never match those of a household with servants and money. The same labour bought her far less dignity than it bought the rich. Whole armies of women earned their living at this work as laundresses and washerwomen, taking in the washing of others for pay. It was common employment for poorer women, and it was as hard as any labour going, carried out over steaming tubs for long, punishing hours. These were the largely invisible hands behind the clean linen of the comfortable, the people whose aching, reddened, water-worn hands kept the whole bright surface of respectable society gleaming. They were essential and almost entirely unseen. There is a quiet truth in all of this that gathers up the whole story of Victorian dress, every spotless collar, every pristine gown, every gleaming display of white that announced a person's status rested upon labour that person never had to see. The cleanliness that signalled wealth and virtue was purchased with someone else's toil, and the finer the appearance, the more hidden work stood behind it. Beneath the beautiful surface lay a great deal of sweat, so the humble, brutal business of laundry sat at the very foundation of the era's obsession with appearances, the unseen labour that made all the signalling possible, and a reminder that behind every clean, bright, respectable outfit stood someone who had paid for it in aching effort. And so we come to the end of the day, fully dressed, thoroughly judged, and quietly exhausted by it all. Before you drift off, let's take a gentle moment to look back on everything your clothes had to say, and to be grateful for the soft, unbothered comfort you're lying in right now. And so the day ends, as every day did, with you finally, mercifully, allowed to stop being looked at. Think back over everything you wore and everything it whispered on your behalf. The corset that reorganized your ribs, the skirt so wide it declared war on doorways, the collar kept impossibly white so the world would know you did no dirty work, the gloves hiding your hands, the hat measuring your worth in inches, the single good outfit guarded like treasure for the one day it truly mattered. From the moment you woke, you did not simply get dressed. You put on your entire reputation and carried it, layer by heavy layer, through a world that never once stopped reading you. It was exhausting, and often absurd and quietly cruel. And yet people lived whole lives inside these rules, laced tight and judged hard, and still found room to court and marry, to grieve and hope, to keep one clean collar and a little pride against all the odds. Spare a thought, too, for the unseen hands behind it all, the ones bent over scalding tubs so that someone else could gleam. Every spotless shirt in that world rested on somebody's aching afternoon. So tonight, as you lie here in whatever soft and shapeless thing you please, unlaced, uncorseted, and gloriously unjudged, let that be its own small luxury. No one is reading your outfit. No one is ranking you by the whiteness of your cuffs. You can breathe deeply, roll over and drop something on the floor with every intention of leaving it there until morning. Be grateful for that quiet freedom, and for the stubborn, dignified people who endured all those layers so we would not have to. Rest easy now. Sleep well. You have nothing left to prove.